Welcome to Eerie Tales for Restful Sleep, where soothing rain meets gentle horror for peaceful nights. Subscribe, like, comment, and share to join our brave night owl community. Sleep tight, if you dare.
Have you ever scrolled through real estate listings late at night, just out of curiosity, and stumbled across a house that seemed almost too perfect? Maybe it was a sprawling Victorian with stained glass windows, or a modern condo in the heart of the city, or a cozy little cottage with a white picket fence and a garden out front. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a magazine, not on a bargain website. And then you see the price, so low it makes you stop and stare. You check the photos again, looking for the catch. Is it a scam? Is the roof about to collapse? Is there a highway being built next door? But the listing says move-in ready. The photos show sunlit rooms, polished floors, and not a single sign of trouble. The only thing out of place is the price and maybe a line at the bottom. Serious inquiries only. No questions about the past. If you've ever wondered why some houses are so cheap, you're not alone. There's a reason these places sit empty, month after month, while everything else in the neighborhood gets snapped up. There's a reason the landlord never quite meets your eyes when you sign the lease, or the real estate agent rushes you through the tour, skipping over certain rooms. There's a reason the neighbors watch from behind their curtains, whispering to each other as you carry your boxes inside. And if you ask too many questions, you'll get the same answer every time. It's just an old house. They all have their quirks. But what if the quirks aren't just creaky floorboards and drafty windows? What if the real reason is something no one wants to talk about? Something that lingers in the walls, in the shadows, in the silence after midnight? What if the house itself is waiting for you, just as much as you're waiting for a fresh start? This isn't just a story about a haunted house. It's a warning, because every year thousands of people move into homes with histories they'll never know until it's too late. Some of them laugh off the rumors at first. Some of them never notice anything at all. But a few, the unlucky ones, discover the truth the hard way. And by the time they realize what's really going on, the house already has them. Maybe you think you'd never fall for it. Maybe you're the kind of person who does their research, who checks the crime reports and the property records, who asks the neighbors about the last tenants. Maybe you think you'd spot the red flags before you ever set foot inside. But the truth is, the most dangerous houses don't look dangerous at all. They look inviting. They look safe. They look like the answer to all your problems. So why do people keep moving in? Why do the listings keep popping up, month after month, with prices that seem too good to be true? Why do the stories keep circulating? Stories of footsteps in empty hallways, of cold spots that never go away, of faces in the windows at night. Why do some houses seem to swallow up their owners, leaving nothing behind but rumors and unanswered questions? Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on the world of too good to be true real estate. We're going to dig into the stories that never make it into the listings, the secrets that get buried with the paperwork, the warnings that come too late. We'll follow the trail from the first too cheap listing to the last desperate escape, and we'll ask the question no one else dares to ask. What's really hiding behind those locked doors? Because the truth is, every house has a story. Some are just more dangerous than others. So before you start dreaming about that perfect place with the perfect price, ask yourself, what would you do if you found out your dream home was someone else's nightmare? Would you still sign the lease? Would you still turn the key in the lock? Or would you walk away, no matter how good the deal seemed? Tonight, you'll hear stories that real estate agents hope you never find out. Stories of tenants who vanished without a trace, of families who fled in the middle of the night, of houses that seem to want something from the people who live in them. You'll hear about the warning signs, the ones you can see, and the ones you can only feel. And you'll learn why sometimes the cheapest house on the block is the one you should fear the most. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and remember, if you ever find yourself standing in an empty house, listening to the silence, wondering why it was so cheap, don't ignore that feeling in the pit of your stomach, because sometimes the house is waiting for you too. And what happens next might just change everything you thought you knew about home. The too good to be true deal. It always starts with hope. That's the part no one ever talks about. The hope that comes before the fear, before the regret, before the sleepless nights. The hope that maybe, just maybe, this time your luck has finally changed. For our protagonist, it began on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when the world feels gray and endless, and every little inconvenience seems to pile up. The divorce papers had been signed just a week before, and the apartment he'd been sharing with his ex was already filled with boxes and silence. He needed a new place, somewhere to start over, somewhere that didn't echo with old arguments and broken promises. But the city was expensive, and every listing he found seemed to mock him with its price tag. Studio apartments with peeling paint and broken appliances went for more than he made in a month. Even the so-called affordable neighborhoods were out of reach. He was about to give up for the day when he saw it, a listing that didn't make sense. Restored Victorian, 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, crown molding, $200 a month, available immediately. The photos looked like something out of a magazine, sunlight streaming through tall windows, a grand staircase with a carved banister, a fireplace framed by intricate tilework. The kitchen was old-fashioned but spotless, the bathroom gleamed, and the backyard was a tangle of wildflowers and ivy. There was even a clawfoot tub, the kind you only ever see in movies. He stared at the price, certain it was a typo, $200 in this neighborhood. He checked the address again, then the map. It was only a few blocks from his new job at the hospital, close enough to walk. He scrolled through the photos again, looking for the catch. Was the roof caving in? Was there black mold in the basement? But every image looked perfect, almost too perfect. The only thing that seemed out of place was the last photo. A shot of the front door, slightly ajar, with the house number barely visible in the shadows. He called the number in the listing, half expecting it to go straight to voicemail or to be answered by a scammer. But a woman picked up on the second ring. Her voice was brisk, businesslike. Yes, it's still available. No, the price isn't a mistake. The owner wants it rented quickly. If you're interested, you can see it today. He was there within the hour, umbrella dripping, heart pounding. The house was even more beautiful in person, its red brick facade softened by years of ivy and rain. The front steps were worn smooth. The porch swing creaked gently in the wind. The woman from the phone, his soon-to-be landlord, met him at the door. She was older, with sharp eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach her face. She handed him a set of keys before he'd even finished introducing himself. "Take your time," she said, waving him inside. "Look around. Let me know if you have any questions." He wandered from room to room, marveling at the details. The hardwood floors gleamed under his feet, the crown molding cast elegant shadows on the walls, and the windows let in just enough light to make the place feel warm and alive. There were little touches everywhere, a vase of fresh flowers on the mantel, a bowl of fruit on the kitchen table, a stack of neatly folded towels in the bathroom. It felt lived in, but not in a bad way, more like someone had taken care to make it welcoming. But as he moved through the house, he started to notice things that didn't quite add up. The radiators clanked and hissed, even though the weather wasn't that cold. Some of the floorboards creaked underfoot, but only in certain spots, almost as if someone had walked the same path over and over again. The shared wall with the neighboring unit seemed unusually thin. He could hear faint sounds, like someone moving furniture or dropping something heavy, even though the landlord insisted the other side was empty. He tried to ignore the unease, telling himself it was just nerves. After all, he'd been through a lot lately. Anyone would feel unsettled moving into a new place alone. He asked the landlord about the price, trying to sound casual. "It's just so low. Is there something wrong with the house?" She shrugged, her eyes darting away. "It's an old place, needs a little work. The owner's not interested in making a profit, just wants someone to take care of it. If you're handy, you'll be fine." He signed the lease that afternoon, barely able to believe his luck. As he carried his boxes inside, the neighbors watched from behind their curtains, their faces unreadable. One woman, Mrs. Chen from next door, came over to introduce herself. She was friendly enough, but her eyes lingered on the house, and her voice dropped to a whisper when she spoke. "You know what happened to the last tenant, right?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. He shook his head, suddenly uneasy. "No, I don't, should I?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "He left in the middle of the night, ran out screaming, they say, ended up in the hospital talking about curses and footsteps, but you seem sensible. I'm sure you'll be fine." He laughed it off, but the words stuck with him. Curses, footsteps. He told himself it was just neighborhood gossip, the kind of story people tell to scare newcomers. Every old house has its legends, its rumors, its secrets. He wasn't superstitious. He was a scientist, a rational man. He needed a place to live, and this was the best deal he'd ever find. That night, as he unpacked his things and tried to make the house feel like home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to move just a little too much. The silence felt a little too deep. He told himself it was just the stress, the exhaustion, the weight of starting over. But as he lay in bed, listening to the house settle around him, he couldn't help but wonder, what had really happened to the last tenant? And why was the rent so low? The next morning, he woke to find a note slipped under his door. The handwriting was neat, almost old-fashioned. "Welcome to the neighborhood. If you hear anything strange at night, don't be afraid. It's just the house getting to know you." He stared at the note for a long time, trying to decide if it was a joke or a warning. He checked the locks on all the doors and windows just to be sure. Everything was secure. The house was quiet, the sun was shining, and for a moment he let himself believe that everything would be okay. But as the days passed, the little oddities began to pile up. The front door stuck, no matter how much he oiled the hinges. The lights flickered at odd hours, even after he replaced the bulbs. The air in the upstairs hallway always felt colder than the rest of the house, no matter how high he turned up the heat. And every night, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he thought he heard footsteps, soft at first, then louder, then gone. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his new job, his new life. But the house wouldn't let him forget. Every time he thought he'd settled in, something else would happen. A door would slam shut for no reason. A window would rattle in a windless night. A shadow would flicker at the edge of his vision. He started to dread coming home, started to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. He called the landlord, trying to sound casual. "Are you sure there's nothing wrong with the house? I keep hearing things at night." She sighed, her voice tired. "It's just an old house. They all make noises. If you're really worried, I can send someone to check it out. But trust me, you'll get used to it." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that he was just being paranoid, that the house was just old and creaky and full of character. But deep down, he knew something was off. The price was too low, the neighbors were too quiet, the landlord was too eager to hand over the keys. And the stories, about curses, about footsteps, about tenants who left in the middle of the night, were starting to feel less like rumors and more like warnings. Still, he stayed. What choice did he have? The rent was cheap, the location was perfect, and he couldn't afford to move again. He told himself he'd get used to the noises, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched. He told himself he'd make it work. But every night, as the house settled around him and the shadows crept across the walls, he wondered, what had he really signed up for? And what was waiting for him in the darkness? Because sometimes the best deals come with the highest price, and sometimes the house chooses you, not the other way around. The first signs. The first week in a new house is always strange. Every sound is unfamiliar. Every shadow seems to move in ways you can't quite explain. But for the protagonist, the strangeness of 42A Sycamore Street was more than just the usual adjustment. It was a feeling that settled into his bones, a sense that the house was watching him as much as he was watching it. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just the stress of moving, the exhaustion of starting over, the echo of old anxieties that hadn't quite faded with the change of address. He set up his furniture, hung his clothes in the closet, and tried to fill the empty rooms with the routines of normal life. Wake up at 6, shower, coffee, commute to the hospital, come home, microwave dinner, watch a little TV, and try to sleep. The house's quirks became part of the background. The way the front door stuck just enough to make him tug a little harder, the loose step on the staircase that groaned under his weight, the faint smell of old wood and plaster that never quite went away. But even as he settled in, the house seemed to resist. The lights flickered at odd hours, sometimes dimming for just a second, sometimes going out entirely before snapping back to life. The radiators clanked and hissed, filling the rooms with bursts of heat that never lasted long enough to chase away the chill in the upstairs hallway. The air felt heavy, especially at night, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The first real sign came on a Tuesday night in October. He'd gone to bed early, hopping to catch up on sleep after a long shift at the hospital. The city was quiet outside, the kind of deep silence that only comes in the small hours of the morning. He was drifting in that space between waking and dreaming when a sound yanked him back to full awareness. A heavy, deliberate thud, coming from the hallway directly above his bedroom. He lay still, heart pounding, listening as the footsteps moved across the floor above him. Thud, pause, the old floorboards groaned under each impact, the sound echoing through the house like a warning. He told himself it was just the house settling, just the old wood shifting in the night. But the footsteps were too regular, too purposeful, too human. He grabbed his phone and the baseball bat he kept under the bed, creeping up the stairs with every muscle tense. The second floor was pitch black, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, filtering through the curtains in thin, ghostly lines. He checked every room, the empty spare bedroom, the bathroom, the small office he'd set up for paperwork and bills. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no open windows, no explanation for the footsteps that had stopped as soon as he reached the top of the stairs. He went back to bed, telling himself it was nothing. Old houses make noises, everyone knows that. But the next night at almost exactly the same time, the footsteps returned. This time they didn't just cross the hallway, they paced back and forth for nearly an hour. He lay rigid in bed, the bat clutched to his chest, listening to the slow, methodical thuds as they traversed the hallway above him. When the footsteps finally stopped, he was too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. By the third night, he was desperate for answers. He called the landlord, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "I keep hearing footsteps upstairs, heavy ones. Are you sure there's no one else living here?" The landlord sighed, the way people do when they've heard the same complaint too many times. "The place is over 100 years old. Pipes expand and contract, wooden beams shift. It's normal. We had the second floor inspected before you moved in. If you're really concerned, I can send someone to check it out next week." But he couldn't wait that long. The footsteps came every night now, always around 2 in the morning, always with the same slow, heavy rhythm. He started sleeping with every light in the house on, hoping the brightness would chase away whatever was making the sounds. He installed a security system, double-checked every lock, even called the police one night when the footsteps seemed louder than ever. But by the time they arrived, the house was silent, and the officers found nothing suspicious. The lack of sleep started to wear on him. He dozed off at work, mixed up patient files, and found himself staring at X-rays without really seeing them. His supervisor noticed, suggesting he take some time off to rest, but rest was impossible. The house wouldn't let him. He became obsessed with finding an explanation. He spent hours researching the house's history, digging through old records at the Baltimore County office. The documents went back to the house's construction in 1891, listing a series of owners and tenants over the decades. Nothing remarkable stood out. No deaths recorded at the address, no violent crimes, nothing to explain the sense of dread that had settled over him like a second skin. But the neighbors knew more than the records did. Mrs. Chen, who had first warned him about the last tenant, stopped him in the hallway one afternoon. "You look tired," she said, her voice gentle. "Are you sleeping okay?" He hesitated, then nodded. Just getting used to the new place, I guess." She gave him a look that said she didn't believe him. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." He started to notice other things, too. The mailman avoided his front steps, leaving letters in the box at the end of the walkway instead of bringing them to the door. Delivery drivers dropped packages on the porch and hurried away without waiting for a signature. Even the neighborhood cats, usually bold and curious, gave the house a wide berth, slinking past with their tails low and their ears flat. The house itself seemed to change as the days went by. The shadows grew deeper, the air colder, the silence heavier. He found himself jumping at every sound, flinching when the floorboards creaked or the radiators hissed. He started to dread the approach of midnight, knowing that the footsteps would come soon, that the house would come alive with noises that had no explanation. One night, as he was brushing his teeth, he caught a glimpse of movement in the bathroom mirror, a shadow passing behind him just out of sight. He spun around, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. He told himself it was just his imagination, just a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched never went away. He tried to invite friends over, hoping that company would break the spell the house seemed to have cast over him. But every time he made plans, something came up: work emergencies, last-minute cancellations, sudden illnesses. It was as if the house didn't want anyone else inside, as if it was guarding its secrets jealously. The footsteps grew bolder. Sometimes they stopped directly above his bed, the floorboards groaning under a weight he couldn't see. Sometimes they moved down the hallway, pausing outside the spare bedroom or the office, as if searching for something. Once, he heard a faint whisper, so soft he couldn't make out the words, but unmistakably human. He started to keep a journal, writing down every strange occurrence, every unexplained sound, every feeling of dread. The entries grew longer and more frantic as the days passed, the handwriting slanting and uneven. He tried to find patterns to make sense of the chaos. But the only thing that was consistent was the time. Always around 2 in the morning, always when the house was at its quietest. He stopped sleeping in his bedroom, moving to the couch in the living room where the footsteps were less distinct. But even there, the house found him. The lights would flicker, the air would grow cold, and the sense of being watched would return, stronger than ever. He started to wonder if he was losing his mind. Maybe the stress of the divorce, the move, the new job had finally caught up with him. Maybe he was imagining everything, inventing ghosts to explain the loneliness that gnawed at him every night. But the footsteps were real. The cold was real. The fear was real. One night, desperate for answers, he set up his phone to record the sounds. He placed it on the floor in the upstairs hallway, hit record, and went back to bed. The next morning, he played back the audio, heart pounding. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then faintly, the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. And underneath the footsteps, a low, guttural whisper, so soft he had to turn the volume all the way up to hear it. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, frustration, longing. He played the recording for the landlord, hopping for some kind of explanation. She listened in silence, her face unreadable. When the audio ended, she handed the phone back to him without a word. "It's just an old house," she said finally. "They all have their secrets." He left her office feeling more alone than ever. The days blurred together, each one darker and colder than the last. The house seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows growing longer. He stopped answering the phone, stopped going out except for work. He became a ghost in his own life, drifting from room to room, waiting for the next sign, the next sound, the next proof that he wasn't alone. And every night, as the clock crept toward 2 in the morning, he lay awake, listening to the footsteps above him, wondering what they wanted, and how much longer he could last before the house claimed him too. But the worst was yet to come, because the house was just getting started, the history no one talks about. Obsession is a slow poison. It doesn't hit all at once. It seeps in, drop by drop, until you realize you're thinking about nothing else. For the protagonist, the house at 42A Sycamore Street became more than just a place to sleep. It became a puzzle he couldn't stop trying to solve, a riddle that gnawed at him every waking hour and haunted his dreams at night. It started with the footsteps, of course, but soon the need for answers took over. He found himself staring at the ceiling in the dark, counting the seconds between each heavy thud, wondering who or what could be packing the hallway above him. He replayed the audio recordings over and over, straining to catch a word, a name, a clue. He scoured the house for anything out of place: loose floorboards, hidden compartments, strange stains on the walls. Every creak, every draft, every flicker of the lights became a message he was desperate to decode. But the house kept its secrets well. The official records were a dead end. The Baltimore County Archives listed the property as a Victorian row house, constructed 1891. The chain of ownership was long and unremarkable, a series of families, a few rental agreements, nothing that stood out. No deaths on the property, no fires, no police reports. The only recent entry was the lease signed by David Foster, the previous tenant, the one who, according to Mrs. Chen, had run screaming into the night. That name became the first thread he could pull. He searched online for any mention of David Foster and found almost nothing. No social media, no news stories, just a single address on a hospital intake form. Spring Grove Hospital, a psychiatric facility on the edge of the city. The same place Mrs. Chen had whispered about. He hesitated for days before making the call. The receptionist was polite but firm. "We can't give out information about our patients." He tried again, this time pretending to be a relative. After a long wait, he was told he could visit during the next family hour. The hospital was a world away from the city's bustle, quiet, sterile, and heavy with the weight of unspoken stories. When they finally brought David Foster into the visiting room, the protagonist barely recognized him from the faded driver's license photo he'd found in the rental paperwork. Foster's hair had gone completely gray. His face was lined with exhaustion, and his hands trembled as he sat down. The first thing Foster said was, "You're hearing them too, aren't you? Always at 2 a.m. The protagonist nodded, leaning forward. "What are they? What's causing them?" Foster's eyes darted around the room as if afraid of being overheard. "It's not what, it's who." The original owner, Harrison Blake. He built both houses, lived in 42A, died there too, 1916, fell down the stairs and broke his neck. Foster's voice dropped to a whisper. But he never left. He's still there, packing, always packing, looking for something. The protagonist shook his head. "There's no record of anyone dying in the house. I checked." Foster's grip tightened on his arm, because they covered it up. His family didn't want a scandal, but I found letters, old newspapers. Blake was obsessed with the occult, conducted rituals in the basement, tried to contact the dead. Foster's voice trembled. He succeeded too well, opened a door he couldn't close. That's why the footsteps never stop. That's why they get louder, closer. A nurse appeared, her voice gentle but firm. "Time up, Mr. Foster." As she led him away, Foster called back, "Check the basement. Behind the coal chute, the truth is there." The words echoed in the protagonist's mind all the way home. That night he couldn't sleep. He paced the house, retracing the steps he'd heard so many times above his head. Finally, as dawn crept through the windows, he grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dust and the scent of old stone. The coal chute was still there, sealed up decades ago when the house was converted to gas heat. He ran his hands along the wall, searching for anything loose. After a few minutes, his fingers found a brick that shifted under pressure. He pried it free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a metal box, badly rusted but still intact. He carried it upstairs, hands shaking, and pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. The pages were yellow and brittle, the handwriting cramped but legible. It was Harrison Blake's personal diary. Most of the entries were mundane business records, notes about repairs, lists of expenses. But as the months went on, the writing grew erratic. Blake wrote about experiments with seances and spirit boards, about voices in the walls, about footsteps that followed him through the house. He described dreams of shadowy figures, of doors that opened onto darkness, of cold hands reaching for him in the night. The final entry was dated October 31, 1916. "It's here. God help me, it's here. I can hear it coming up the stairs. The ritual worked, but I was wrong about everything. So wrong. It's not a door to the other side. It's a door to something else. Something that was never meant to." The entry ended mid-sentence. The protagonist sat in silence, the journal open in his lap, the weight of a century's worth of secrets pressing down on him. He thought about the footsteps, the cold, the whispers. He thought about David Foster, broken and terrified in his hospital room. He thought about Mrs. Chen, about the neighbors who never stayed long, about the mailman who wouldn't come to the door. He started to see the house differently. The elegant crown molding, the polished floors, the sunlight streaming through the windows, all of it was a mask, hiding something rotten underneath. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was also hungry. It wanted something, and it had been waiting a long time. He tried to talk to the neighbors, hoping for more answers. Most of them were polite but distant, unwilling to say much. But one old man who'd lived on the block for decades was more forthcoming. "That house has always been trouble," he said, shaking his head. "People come and go, never stay long, always some excuse, job transfer, family emergency, sudden illness. But everyone knows the truth. Some places just aren't meant to be lived in." Rumors swirled around the house like autumn leaves. Some said they'd seen lights flickering in the windows at night, long after the last tenant had left. Others whispered about strange figures in the backyard, about voices calling from empty rooms, about pets that refused to cross the threshold. There were stories about children who went missing, about fires that started for no reason, about shadows that moved against the grain of the light. The protagonist collected every story he could find, piecing together a history that was never written down. He found an old newspaper clipping about a seance gone wrong in 1916, a brief mention of a tragedy at the address. He found a letter from the 1950s, written by a woman who begged her sister to let her stay, saying she couldn't spend another night in the house. He found a police report from the 1970s, describing a tenant who vanished without a trace, leaving all his belongings behind. The more he learned, the more the house seemed to close in around him. The footsteps grew louder, the cold deeper, the whispers more insistent. He started to see things out of the corner of his eye, shadows that didn't belong, faces in the glass, hands reaching from the darkness. He stopped inviting people over, stopped answering the phone, stopped leaving the house except for work. He realized with a kind of sick certainty that he was repeating the same pattern as every tenant before him. The house was wearing him down, night by night, step by step. It was only a matter of time before he broke, before he ran screaming into the night, before he became just another rumor, just another warning whispered to the next unlucky soul who signed the lease. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he understood what the house wanted. Not until he found a way to break the cycle. He spent his days researching, his nights listening, his dreams filled with the sound of footsteps and the echo of voices from a century ago. The house was no longer just a place to live. It was a living thing, a predator, a puzzle with a price. And as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, he realized that the history no one talked about wasn't just the story of the house. It was the story of everyone who had ever tried to call it home. Because some houses don't want to be lived in. Some houses want to be remembered. And some houses never let go. The night everything changed. There's a moment in every haunted house story when the line between the ordinary and the impossible finally snaps. For weeks, the protagonist had lived in a state of uneasy truce with the house, enduring the footsteps, the cold, the whispers, the sense of being watched. He'd convinced himself that if he just kept his head down, if he just ignored the signs, maybe the house would lose interest. Maybe it would let him be. But houses like this don't let go. They wait, they watch, and then when you're at your weakest, they make their move. It was a Thursday night in late October, the kind of night when the wind rattles the windows and the darkness outside feels thick enough to touch. The protagonist had tried everything to keep the fear at bay. He'd left every light in the house burning, the television playing old sitcoms at a low volume, the radio in the kitchen tuned to a late-night talk show. He'd even scattered salt across the thresholds, a trick he'd read about in one of the old letters he'd found in the attic. Anything to keep the shadows at bay. But the house was patient. It waited until he was almost asleep, his mind drifting in that vulnerable space between dreams and waking. That's when the footsteps started, earlier than usual, louder than ever. They thundered across the upstairs hallway, shaking the light fixtures and sending dust drifting from the ceiling. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, the baseball bat already in his hands. This time, the footsteps didn't stop at the end of the hallway. They turned, moving into the spare bedroom directly above him. There was a pause, a silence so deep it made his ears ring. Then came a new sound, a slow, deliberate scratching like nails dragging across the hardwood floor. The sound moved in circles, round and round, as if something was searching for a way through. He forced himself out of bed, every muscle tense, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not when he was so close to understanding. He crept up the stairs, the bat gripped tight, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The second floor was colder than he'd ever felt it, the air so frigid his breath came out in white clouds. The hallway was empty, but the door to the spare bedroom was ajar, swinging gently on its hinges. He pushed it open, the old wood groaning under his touch. The room was empty, no footprints in the dust, no sign of anyone or anything having been there. But the cold was worse here, biting through his clothes, numbing his fingers. He swept the flashlight across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing. Then from behind him came the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, moving down the hallway toward the stairs. He spun around, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the darkness. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, moving down the stairs, one at a time, each step groaning under an invisible weight. He followed, heart hammering, the bat raised. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and turned into the living room. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging the house into darkness. The only illumination came from the street lamp outside, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. He heard the footsteps cross the living room, then stop in front of the basement door. There was a pause, a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped turning. Then slowly, the basement door creaked open. He should have run. Every instinct told him to run, but something held him in place. A compulsion, a need to see, to know, to finally understand what the house wanted. He stepped forward, the bat raised, the flashlight beam trembling. The basement stairs yawned before him, a black hole in the center of the house. The cold was worse here, so intense it made his teeth ache. He forced himself down the steps, one at a time, the wood groaning under his weight. At the bottom, the air was thick with the smell of earth and old stone. The beam of the flashlight caught on the old coal chute, the loose brick he'd pried free days before. The metal box was still there, the journal still open on the workbench. But now, something else was waiting. In the far corner of the basement, where the shadows were deepest, he saw movement. A shape, tall and thin, barely visible in the darkness. It stood perfectly still, its face hidden in shadow, its hands hanging at its sides. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The shape took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under its weight. Another step, and the beam of the flashlight caught its face, a face that was both familiar and impossibly wrong. The features were twisted, stretched, the eyes too deep, the mouth too wide. It smiled, a slow, terrible smile that seemed to split its face in two. He stumbled back, the bat slipping from his fingers, the flashlight clattering to the floor. The shape moved closer, its footsteps echoing in the darkness. He could feel its breath on his face, cold and damp, smelling of earth and rot. He ran. He didn't stop to grab anything, not his phone, not his wallet, not even his shoes. He sprinted up the stairs, through the living room, out the front door, and into the night. Behind him, the house seemed to sigh, the door swinging shut with a final, echoing thud. He ran until his lungs burned, until his feet were raw and bleeding, until he collapsed in a heap on the sidewalk 3 blocks away. The world spun around him, the streetlights blurring into halos of gold and white. He heard laughter, deep, guttural, echoing from the direction of the house. He covered his ears, but the sound followed him, burrowing into his mind. The police found him an hour later, huddled in the doorway of a corner store, shivering and babbling. The report noted signs of extreme psychological distress, but found no evidence of an intruder or break-in at 42A Sycamore Street. The hospital admitted him for observation, acute stress reaction, possible psychotic break. He checked himself out after 2 days against medical advice. He never went back to the house. He left everything behind: furniture, clothes, family photos. The landlord kept his security deposit and first month's rent. He didn't care. He moved in with his sister in another city, started looking for a new job, a new place to live, somewhere modern, somewhere with no history, no basements, no secrets. But sometimes, late at night, he still heard them. Heavy footsteps moving slowly across a distant floor, growing louder, closer, until he woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. He wondered about 42A Sycamore Street, about what Harrison Blake had really found with his rituals, about the door he'd opened and the thing that had come through. He wondered if the house was still waiting, still hungry, still searching for the next tenant. And as the days passed and the nightmares faded, he realized the truth. Some houses don't want to be lived in. Some houses want to be remembered. And some houses never let go. The house was for rent again, $200 a month, a steal for Baltimore. The listing was already up, the photos as beautiful as ever. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains, waiting to see who would move in next. And somewhere in the darkness, the footsteps began again, the hidden truth. After that night, nothing felt real anymore. The world outside 42A Sycamore Street was bright and ordinary, cars passing, people laughing, the sun rising and setting as if nothing had changed. But for the protagonist, reality had split. There was the world everyone else saw, and then there was the world of the house, a place where footsteps echoed in empty rooms, where cold air pressed against your skin like a warning, where secrets waited in the dark. He tried to move on. He told himself it was over, that he'd escaped, that the house couldn't reach him anymore. But the questions gnawed at him. Why had the house chosen him? What had really happened to Harrison Blake? What was the thing that moved in the shadows, that smiled with a mouth too wide, that left footprints in the dust but never showed its face in the light? He couldn't let it go. Even as he tried to rebuild his life, new job, new apartment, new routines, he found himself drawn back to the mystery. He spent hours online, searching for any mention of the house, of Harrison Blake, of David Foster, of anyone who had ever lived at that address. The deeper he dug, the stranger the story became. There were rumors, of course. There always are. Some said the house was built on cursed ground, that the land had once belonged to a family who vanished without a trace. Others claimed that Harrison Blake had been a member of a secret society, that he'd held midnight meetings in the basement, that he tried to summon something from the other side. There were stories about a hidden room, sealed off after Blake's death, where strange symbols were carved into the walls and the air was always cold, no matter the season. The official records were silent. No mention of rituals, no police reports, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. But the unofficial history, the whispered stories, the old letters, the diary entries scrawled in the margins of forgotten books, told a different tale. One night, unable to sleep, the protagonist found himself staring at the journal he'd taken from the house. He'd read it a dozen times, but now, in the quiet of his new apartment, he noticed something he'd missed before. A series of numbers, written in the back cover in a shaky hand. They looked like dates, but none of them matched anything in the diary. He cross-referenced them with the house's history, with old newspaper archives, with city records. One date stood out: October 31, 1916, the night of Blake's final entry. He dug deeper, searching for any mention of that night. In a forgotten corner of the Baltimore Historical Society's digital archives, he found a single, cryptic article: "Local man dies in tragic fall, no foul play suspected." The article was brief, almost dismissive, but in the comments section, buried beneath decades of digital dust, someone had written, "They say he was trying to close a door that should never have been opened." The phrase sent a chill down his spine. He remembered Foster's words in the hospital. He succeeded too well, opened a door he couldn't close. He remembered the cold in the basement, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was waiting just out of sight. He started to piece together the fragments: the rituals, the footsteps, the cold spots, the faces in the glass. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a wound, a place where something had broken through. Maybe it was Blake's fault, maybe it was something older, something that had always been there, waiting for someone to let it in. He reached out to local historians, to paranormal investigators, to anyone who might know more. Most of them dismissed his questions, but a few responded with stories of their own. One woman who'd grown up on the block told him about the time her dog refused to go near the house, barking and growling at the empty windows. Another man claimed to have seen lights flickering in the basement late at night, long after the house was supposed to be empty. A retired police officer remembered being called to the address for disturbances, always at the same time, always with the same result: nothing found, nothing explained. The most disturbing story came from a former tenant who reached out after seeing a post on a local message board. She described the same footsteps, the same cold, the same sense of being watched. But she also mentioned something new: a hidden door in the basement behind the old furnace. "I found it by accident," she wrote. "It was painted over, but you could see the outline if you looked closely. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The next day, the footsteps started. I moved out a week later." The protagonist's mind raced. He remembered the coal chute, the loose brick, the journal. Had he missed something? Was there another secret, another room, another door? He went back to the house, not inside, but close enough to see the windows, to feel the weight of its gaze. The new tenant hadn't lasted long. The house was empty again, the curtains drawn, the porch swing creaking in the wind. He circled the block, looking for any sign of life, any clue that might explain what he'd experienced. He saw Mrs. Chen in her garden, her eyes wary. She nodded at him but didn't speak. He wanted to ask her what she knew, but the words caught in his throat. Some secrets, he realized, were too heavy to share. He left a note in the mailbox, addressed to the next tenant. In it, he wrote everything he'd learned: the footsteps, the cold, the journal, the hidden door. He warned them to be careful, to trust their instincts, to leave if the house ever felt wrong. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but it felt like the only thing he could do. As he walked away, he glanced back one last time. The house stood silent, its windows dark, its secrets safe for now. But he knew it was only a matter of time before someone else moved in, before the cycle began again. He wondered if the house would ever be satisfied, if the door would ever close, if the footsteps would ever stop. He doubted it. Some wounds never heal. Some doors never close. Some houses never let go. And somewhere in the darkness, the footsteps began again. The escape or not. There's a point in every nightmare when you realize you can't wake up. For the protagonist, that moment came not with a scream, but with a whisper. A soft, insistent voice that seemed to rise from the floorboards, from the walls, from the very air itself. It was the house, speaking in the only language it knew: footsteps, cold, and dread. He had tried everything to break the cycle. He'd left the lights on, scattered salt, burned sage, recited prayers he barely remembered from childhood. He'd called priests, psychics, even a local ghost hunting team who spent a single night in the house before packing up their equipment and leaving without a word. Nothing worked. The footsteps kept coming every night, always at the same time, always with the same slow, deliberate rhythm. Sleep became impossible. He started to lose track of time, the days blurring together in a haze of exhaustion and fear. He stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from his sister, stopped leaving the house except for the barest necessities. The outside world faded, replaced by the endless, echoing corridors of 42A Sycamore Street. He began to see things, shapes moving in the corners of his vision, faces reflected in the glass that vanished when he turned to look. The cold grew worse, seeping into his bones, making his teeth chatter even when the radiators were burning hot. The whispers grew louder, sometimes forming words he almost understood, sometimes dissolving into a chorus of sighs and moans. He knew he had to leave, but the house seemed to sense his intentions, tightening its grip with every passing day. Doors that had once opened easily now stuck fast, their locks refusing to turn. Windows that had let in the morning sun now showed only darkness, no matter the hour. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing down on him until every breath felt like a struggle. One night, as the footsteps began their nightly march, he made his decision. He would leave no matter what. He packed a single bag, just the essentials: wallet, phone, a change of clothes, the journal he'd found in the basement. He left everything else behind, knowing he'd never want to see any of it again. He waited until the footsteps reached the far end of the upstairs hallway, then slipped quietly down the stairs, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the house could hear it. He reached the front door, fingers trembling as he fumbled with the lock. For a moment, it refused to turn, the key grinding uselessly in the ancient mechanism. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to ignore the cold breath on the back of his neck. Finally, with a shuddering groan, the lock gave way. He yanked the door open and stepped out into the night, the air outside shockingly warm after the chill of the house. He didn't look back. He ran, feet pounding the sidewalk, lungs burning, the bag bouncing against his side. He ran until the house was out of sight, until the streetlights grew brighter and the sounds of the city returned. He made it to his sister's apartment just before dawn, collapsing on her couch in a heap of exhaustion and relief. She listened to his story in silence, her face pale, her eyes wide. She didn't ask questions. She just let him sleep, and when he woke, she made him coffee and promised he could stay as long as he needed. For a while, it seemed like the nightmare was over. The footsteps were gone. The cold had lifted, the whispers had faded. He started to rebuild his life, piece by piece, day by day. He found a new job, a new apartment, a new routine. He tried not to think about the house, about the things he'd seen and heard, about the secrets he'd uncovered. But the house wasn't finished with him. It started with the dreams. At first, they were just fragments, shadows moving in empty rooms, the sound of footsteps echoing down endless hallways, the feeling of being watched. Then they grew more vivid. He found himself back in the house, wandering from room to room, searching for something he couldn't name. The cold returned, seeping into his bones, making him shiver even in his sleep. Sometimes he woke to find himself standing at the window, staring out into the darkness, his breath fogging the glass. Once, he found the journal open on his nightstand, even though he was sure he'd packed it away in a box in the closet. The pages were blank, except for a single line scrawled in a shaky hand. "You can leave, but you can't escape." He tried to ignore it, to tell himself it was just stress, just the lingering effects of trauma. But the signs kept coming. He started to hear footsteps in his new apartment, soft at first, then louder, then unmistakable. He checked the locks, the windows, the floorboards. Everything was normal, but the footsteps kept coming, always at the same time, always with the same slow, deliberate rhythm. He reached out to other former tenants, desperate for answers. Some responded, sharing their own stories, stories of cold spots, of whispers, of dreams that never ended. One woman told him she'd moved across the country, but still woke every night at 2 a.m., heart pounding, certain she was being watched. Another man said he'd burned everything he'd owned from the house, but the nightmares never stopped. The rumors grew darker. Some said the house was cursed, that anyone who lived there was marked. that the footsteps would follow them wherever they went. Others claimed the house was alive, that it fed on fear, that it needed someone to remember it, to carry its story forward. A few whispered that the only way to break the cycle was to go back, to face whatever waited in the darkness, to close the door that Harrison Blake had opened so many years ago. He considered it. He thought about returning, about confronting the house one last time, about finding a way to end the nightmare for good. But every time he got close, something stopped him. A chill in the air, a shadow in the corner, a whisper in his ear. Not yet. He realized with a kind of weary resignation that escape was never really possible. The house was part of him now, its secrets woven into the fabric of his life. He could run, he could hide, he could start over as many times as he wanted. But the footsteps would always find him. The cold would always return. The whispers would always call his name. He started to write everything down, hoping that by telling his story he could warn others. He posted on forums, sent letters to local newspapers, even tried to contact paranormal investigators. Most people dismissed him as a crank, a victim of stress or mental illness. But a few listened, a few believed, a few shared their own stories, their own escapes, their own failures. He realized he wasn't alone. The house had touched more lives than he could count, its influence spreading like a stain across the city, across the years. Some people escaped, most didn't, but all of them carried something with them, a memory, a fear, a story that refused to die. And so the cycle continued. The house stood empty, waiting for the next tenant, the next victim, the next chapter in its endless story. The rent stayed low, the listing stayed up, the neighbors watched from behind their curtains, and somewhere in the darkness, the footsteps began again. He knew he would never truly escape, but he also knew he could fight back in his own way. He could tell the truth. He could warn others. He could refuse to let the house win. Because sometimes escape isn't about running away. Sometimes it's about surviving, about remembering, about refusing to let the darkness have the last word. And as long as he kept telling his story, as long as he kept the memory alive, the house would never truly win. But every night, as the clock crept toward 2 in the morning, he listened for the footsteps, wondering if this would be the night they finally found him again. And somewhere in the silence, the house waited. The aftermath, an ominous warning. The story doesn't end when you leave the house. That's the part no one ever tells you. People think escape is a finish line, a moment when the nightmare is over and the world returns to normal. But the truth is, some places never let you go. They follow you quietly, like a shadow you can't shake. They linger in your thoughts and your dreams, in the way you flinch at every creak of the floor or whisper of the wind. For the protagonist, life after 42A Sycamore Street was a study in contradictions. On the surface, everything seemed fine. He found a new apartment, modern, bright, with no history and no hidden rooms. He started a new job, reconnected with his sister, tried to rebuild the routines that had once made him feel safe. He filled his days with noise and light, with the company of people who didn't know what he'd been through. But the house was never far away. It lived in the corners of his mind, in the spaces between thoughts. Sometimes he'd catch himself staring at a blank wall, certain he'd seen movement just out of the corner of his eye. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced he'd heard footsteps in the hallway. He'd lie there, holding his breath, waiting for the sound to come again. Most nights it didn't, but sometimes, just sometimes, it did. He tried to explain it to people at first. He told his sister, his friends, even a therapist. Most of them listened politely, then changed the subject. A few looked at him with concern, as if wondering if he was losing his grip. He learned to keep the story to himself, to let people believe he was just another survivor of a bad year, a bad breakup, a bad dream. But he knew better. He knew the difference between a nightmare and a memory. He knew what it felt like to be hunted by a house, to be marked by something that didn't care if you believed in it or not. He kept writing, kept searching for answers. He joined online forums, read every book he could find about haunted houses, curses, and places that seemed to feed on the people who lived in them. He found others, people with stories like his, people who had escaped but never really left. They shared their own warnings, their own rituals, their own ways of keeping the darkness at bay. Some of them believed the house was a kind of parasite, feeding on fear and loneliness, growing stronger with every tenant it broke. Others thought it was a wound in the world, a place where something terrible had happened and never healed. A few whispered about doors that should never be opened, about rituals gone wrong, about the price of curiosity. But no one had an answer. No one knew how to stop it. The best anyone could do was survive and warn the next person. The protagonist became obsessed with the listings. Every few weeks, he'd check the rental sites searching for 42A Sycamore Street. The ad always came back sooner or later. The price never changed. The photos were always the same: sunlit rooms, polished floors, a house that looked like a dream. Sometimes he'd see a new name on the mailbox, a new car in the driveway. Sometimes the house would sit empty for months, the curtains drawn, the porch swing creaking in the wind. He wondered about the people who moved in. Did they notice the cold spots? Did they hear the footsteps? Did they find the journal, the hidden door, the letters from tenants who came before? Did they last a week, a month, a year? Or did they vanish, leaving nothing behind but rumors and warnings? He wanted to help them, to warn them, to save them from what he'd been through. But he knew the truth. Most people wouldn't listen. Most people would see the price, the photos, the promise of a fresh start, and convince themselves that the stories were just that, stories, until it was too late. So he wrote this for you, for anyone who's ever scrolled through listings late at night, dreaming of a new beginning, for anyone who's ever wondered why some houses are so cheap, why some places never seem to keep their tenants, why the neighbors always look away when you move in. He wrote this as a warning. If you ever find yourself standing in an empty house, listening to the silence, feeling the hair on the back of your neck stand up for no reason, trust your instincts. If the price seems too good to be true, if the landlord won't answer your questions, if the neighbors won't meet your eyes, walk away. No matter how desperate you are, no matter how much you want to believe that this time will be